Welcome, everyone. My name is Alexa, and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining us for a leadership roadmap for more effective Agile with Steve McConnell and Jeff Payne.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexa. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending our next webinar. This one is entitled Leadership Roadmap for More Effective Agile. As always, my name is Jeff Payne. I'm the CEO and founder of Coveros. We're a company that helps organizations accelerate their delivery by applying Agile and DevOps methods to improve your software development process. I've run a couple of companies over the last couple of decades. I do a lot of writing and speaking on Agile and DevOps and related topics of quality and security. And I'm also the technical editor of Agile Connection, which is an online Agile and DevOps community. We publish fresh content every month. And if you're interested, it's free. You can go to agileconnection.com and sign up. I am very happy today to have with me a special guest, longtime colleague, longtime friend, Steve McConnell. He's best known for his books on Code Complete and rapid development, and his most recent book, More Effective Agile. Steve, welcome to the webinar, and tell us more about yourself.
Hey, Jeff. It's nice to be here and great to have a chance to catch up. Yeah, I've been in the software industry for longer than I want to admit. And my book, I'm probably best known for my book, Code Complete. The second edition of that book came out in 2004. And I spent time focusing on software construction and design practices, and really more recently, more focused on software estimation and Agile practices. And my interest has really been in how do you make software projects work overall? How do you make teams effective? How do you make the project successful? Certainly the lower level coding issues have, that's where the rubber hits the road. So that's always going to be important. But I think that the trickier issues to address tend to be the human interaction issues and the team and even to some degree the organizational and leadership issues. So I've been focusing on those areas more in recent years.
Very cool. Welcome, Steve. It's great to have you on the webinar today. I'm looking forward to our conversation about your new book and your thoughts on effective Agile. That's a little bit about Steve and I and where we're coming from. We want to hear a little bit about your role in the organization and kind of what you're focused on. And so I'm going to launch a poll here in a second, and just asking what your role is, primary role in the organization. Many of us are playing many roles, right? But what is your primary role? If it's an other, meaning it's not listed there, just put it into the chat so we all know who is on board here. Let's look at the results. All right, so here's where we are. It looks like audience primarily is testers, Scrum Master / managers, product owners, and then some operations folks, DevOps folks, an Agile coach, some developers. Steve, any thoughts or comments on the kind of the audience and how it relates to the topic? What do you think?
I think it looks like a pretty representative distribution of who I would expect to see on a topic like this. Maybe a little underrepresented with development, but other than that, it looks like a pretty representative list.
Oh, having run a security company, I am bummed that nobody from security is engaged in this discussion. Right. It's kind of important, right, from a leadership perspective. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for doing that. Yeah, so a little bit about what we're going to cover in the webinar here today. First, we're going to start off and talk about some key aspects for Agile leadership and associated with everything from teams to organizational structures to culture, and get Steve's thoughts from his book on some of the key issues and key things that leaders can do to make Agile effective in their organizations. And then after we have a chat about that, we're going to finish up with a poll where we're going to ask you, based on these various attributes of effective leadership, how effective do you think your Agile is in your organization? We'll let you vote, aggregate those results so you can kind of see where you stand versus others. And then we'll do a Q&A at the end with Steve. You can ask your questions, and we'll go from there. So let's jump right into it. So Steve, let me ask you a question. So in your book, More Effective Agile, you discuss, all sorts of aspects around a leader's role, right, in the Agile process and in Agile. And we're
Right.
going to talk about culture and organizations in a bit, but I want to start with teams, right? What challenges do you see from a team perspective? What are the issues specific to teams that leaders need to really see and understand and fix in your experience?
Well, I think this is a terrific place to start the conversation. And this is really the place I think a lot of organizations and teams start in thinking about Agile. And in a lot of ways, this is actually a really difficult place to start. The idea in Agile is that we're going to have self-managing cross-functional teams. And that turns out to be quite a high bar. And I think a lot of organizations end up being challenged or really failing to put the pieces in place really at this first step. And so, one piece of this is that we need the team to be truly cross-functional. And if we're talking about Scrum, we're going to try to put together a cross-functional team with 5 to 9 people, and then trying to get the full set of disciplines that we need to have a truly meaningfully cross-functional team and still keep it limited to 5 to 9 people ends up being a pretty big challenge. And so, especially if we throw in the idea that we really would ideally like to develop in vertical slices, now we're saying we've got to have the product owner or requirements expertise, we've got to have the architecture expertise, we've got to have any usability, a database expertise, and we've got to have that across the whole stack and across the whatever the business concerns are. So this idea of cross-functional ends up being a super high bar, and I think a lot of agile implementations don't really appreciate or respect just how important that is, but also how difficult it is. You can't just randomly pick 5 or 6 or 7 people and stick them together and say, oh, that kind of makes sense, and we'll call them a cross-functional team. What you really need to have is you need to have all the expertise and also all the authority in the team so that the team can make a very high percentage of their decisions locally, and then have those decisions actually be binding locally. That is respected by the rest of the organization, and high willingness that the rest of the organization will uphold those decisions. So I think uh, what most organizations really need to step up to as they put together their agile teams is essentially some staff development. It's going to be the case that they probably don't have a high enough what I call role density, people who have individuals who have a cross-functional skill set, not just each team member having one skill and then that being cross-functional, but each individual having a cross-functional skill set. And the more that we can have the individuals cross-trained in various disciplines, and I call that high role density, the more people are going to overlap with each other. And that means there's going to be better communication, less chance of miscommunication, uh, and just a higher overall ability to move quickly, make good decisions, not regret those decisions, not have the rest of the organization try to unwind those decisions, and so on. So I think that putting together the team, the very first step of just who's on the team and what are their capabilities, uh, is a surprisingly challenging step. And so, we see a lot of agile implementations, as I'm sure you do too, that are pretty far down the road, but they haven't really taken a good first step. They're trying to be far down the road, but they don't have the right skill set on the teams, and so trying to be super successful later when the very foundation, the cornerstone, is not set up well, that makes everything else either just more difficult or just not possible.
Yeah, and I love that you call it high role density. That's a great way to describe it. Kind of what I've seen there is if you don't have people who over time at least become more cross-trained and higher density, then it's really easy to lapse back into kind of a waterfall mentality, right? Because everybody has their specialty and they're still thinking about it in terms of, well, I work after this person gives me something, and it kind of becomes many waterfalls. Have you
Yeah.
seen that, being an issue if you're not figuring out how to get cross-functional?
Well, I think that definitely goes to the topic of individual skills development. And, you and I have been doing this long enough. We can both go back to the software CMM. And in the CMM, they talked about willingness to perform, commitment to perform, and ability to perform.
Mm.
And, one of the problems we see is the organization has a willingness to perform, they make a commitment to perform, but if they don't develop the ability to perform in the staff, they're just not going to be able to perform. And so, waving a magic wand and saying, okay, everybody's now doing Scrum, but without providing any sort of training or skills development in Scrum, then you don't have the ability to perform. And it doesn't really matter if you're committed. You commit all you want, but what that does is it gives rise to what you said. The staff falls back to what's familiar. It's hard enough to get people to try something new, even if they've had some skills development, but trying to get them to try something new without the skills development is kind of a fool's errand. And I think the other piece of that, well, I'll let you go ahead. I've been talking long enough. Go ahead.
No, this is a great topic, and I completely agree with you. And the agile skills, as you mentioned, and we always push this at Coveros, is training really gives you kind of insight into an idea or some initial thoughts on the idea. It's not learning necessarily, right? It's more exposure to concepts and ideas and thoughts, and you have to take that back and apply it and use it and reinforce it. And that's something important for leadership, right? Is to really reinforce these agile skills that you're asking your team to do. Otherwise, they're not going to really latch onto it, right?
Yeah, I think it is difficult to get people to do something different, and you do really have to have a lot of pieces in place. I think the good news for quite a while now, certainly the last 10 years, if not longer, has been, I think there's a very high awareness at the individual contributor level of people wanting to have agile skill sets. They recognize that that's valuable. They recognize that they like working that way. And so I think maybe more than in, some other areas, there's a desire to develop the skill set. And so I think that's definitely a plus. The other thing I think that's worth throwing in here is just the whole idea of how urgency addicted most organizations are, where the urgent takes priority over the important. And so that's another challenge with the skills development, is if everybody's always so task focused on whatever needs to happen this week that there's never any time to develop the skills to get better, that's a pretty common pattern as well. And so and I think that the role density diagram is an interesting one, because if you have the diagram on the left where people are not overlapping very much, that's suggestive that people can't really flex in and support each other all that often. Whereas if you have the role density diagram on the right, where people do overlap in their ability to contribute, that means people can flex and support each other, not just by doing their own specialty, but by helping people out in other specialties. And so that ends up setting up a scenario where people can pick up slack from each other. It opens up space for people to do some learning. And as you said, I think training is great for exposure. It's great for concepts, and that clearly needs to be reinforced with practice on projects. And we refer to this as the FTI syndrome, the failure to implement syndrome, where if you get something in the classroom, but then you go back to your organization and you don't actually have time to implement what you've learned, or the organization, the person who's gone through the training feels like their organization is putting up roadblocks that prevent them from implementing what they've learned, that gives rise to some cynicism and demotivation about whether the organization is really trying to move in that direction, or whether they're just going through the motions. So again, I think you have to get a lot of pieces right here before you really start to move the needle on performance, and how you compose the teams, how you make sure that the teams are adequately skilled. This ends up being a bigger piece of the equation, I think, than a lot of organizations and leaders realize. Yeah, I think we've seen pairing be quite a mixed bag. I think that the scenario you described of using it to share skills. I'm tempted to say between junior and senior staff, but really it's more between someone who's junior in an area versus someone who's senior in an area.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that be effective. Certainly, pairing on work that's error prone or complex, it makes sense. And after that, I think it just kind of comes down to people's work practice preferences. And I think there definitely are people in the software world who are social and who like to spend their time pairing. Uh, but my observation is that I think a majority of people in the software world really don't want to spend the majority of their time pairing. And so, I kind of come down on this by saying, look, if you're a leader and you've got a staff that wants to pair, the research is pretty clear that that's productive and leads to high quality and there's good skills transfer. So by all means, let people work that way. But I wouldn't force it. I might strongly encourage it for skills transfer, like you suggested initially. Um, but we have one company we work with that does 100% pairing, and that includes they actually do pairing during their job interview process because they see that as such a key part of their technical approach. But I can only think of one company we work with that has that sort of commitment to pairing, and they're definitely an outlier as far as the companies we've worked with are concerned.
Yeah, can you go back, Pam, on the slides, please, to the previous slide? Right there. Thank you. Nope, right there. Yeah,
That's
so
a
let's,
million times clearer,
is it clearer?
but way better.
Oh, okay. Good to hear. Yeah, so let's shift gears and so we've talked about teams for a bit. Let's talk a little bit more about the entire organization and organizational structure and how does Agile fit in? And of course, in most organizations, the whole org isn't Agile necessarily, right?
Yeah, I think one of the I think unfortunate aspects of common agile culture is, I would say, zealousness or an idealism that treats agile as though it's basically, go all in or go home. It's either 100% agile or nothing. And I think this is just completely out of touch with the way that organizations work. Uh, and so what we've seen, and I think this is quite a unique aspect of my More Effective Agile book, and I haven't seen this published anywhere else, is the idea of the agile boundary. And that is that there's always going to be, if you're doing agile practices, there's going to be some part of the organization that is doing those and some part of the organization that's not. And in some organizations, it's individual teams that are doing agile. Certainly during any sort of adoption phase, you'll have individual teams that are piloting Scrum or Kanban or whatnot, and there will be an agile boundary between those pilot teams and the rest of the organization. But even after you have the whole technical organization, if the whole technical organization has fully adopted agile and has been doing it for years, there usually are still other parts of the organization that A, are not doing anything agile, and B, are never going to do anything agile. And that can be HR practices, it can be budgeting practices, it can be, a common one is the customer interface, where you can be as agile as you want, but one of the key principles of agile is that you're supposed to be focused on the customer needs. And if your customer has their own reasons for not wanting to be agile, then you should be focused on that. And so I think pretending the agile boundary doesn't exist isn't very helpful. It just makes the interface between the agile parts of the organization and the non-agile parts more contentious. If you just accept the idea that there is an agile boundary and then treat it as a problem to be solved, or a puzzle to be solved. It's not really a problem, but a puzzle, and say, okay, well, what does it mean that there's a boundary here? Is there some sort of impedance mismatch where we're going to be moving as a team at a faster cadence than the rest of the organization? Are we not going to be able to get response times from the other parts that we ideally would like? Well, what do? We can adapt. That's the whole point of Agile, is to inspect and adapt. And so if we find a boundary and we know that it's challenging, we can either just grumble about it, or we can try to problem solve and come up with a way to make the best of that. And unfortunately, I think a very common agile response is to say, oh, well, we've got to make the rest of the organization agile. Well, I think most organizations perceive that as the tail wagging the dog, and so I mean I think there are two unfortunate aspects. One is common tendency to say we've got to make the rest of the organization agile, and then when that doesn't work, then people just grumble and become cynical and give up. And I don't think that's a very good response. I think you're respecting the rest of the organization, and their competence and their right to choose how they want to work. I think is important and also is consistent with the agile values. Uh, and then I think also just recognizing that if you want to be a respected and valuable member of the organization, whether you're a team, individual contributor, or leader, then you figure out how to work effectively with the rest of the organization. However the rest of the organization wants to work. And use the golf expression, play it as it lies, or deal the cards you deal with deal with the cards you're dealt. Play with the cards you're dealt. But none of us get to define every single aspect of the environment we work in, and figuring out how to make the best of it is just part of the job, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I was kind of, when you were talking there, I was thinking a little bit about DevOps, right? I mean, basically what DevOps, some would say, and I've often said that, DevOps is the extension of Agile principles into operations. And
Yeah.
it almost was like DevOps, to your point, was like, well, these people on the other side aren't Agile, so we're going to make them Agile. And we're going to call it DevOps. And it kind of tried to eat pieces that weren't Agile, which you're saying may not be a great idea. I mean, maybe if it takes hold, I guess it's a good, it could help, but maybe there's some reasons why they weren't. And I would argue that the I guess I would call it the fracturing of DevOps, where now you have software reliability engineering and reliability engineering, and you have all these pieces now to it, is kind of going back, right, to more steps in the process, more boundaries, if you will, maybe in the process, because it's for certain situations that's what works best.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I want to be clear. I'm not saying just give up and don't try to help the rest of the organization. If the organization wants to be more agile, or if you look at it and you have enough business understanding to really know that it would help the rest of the organization, then you can work with other parts of the organization, and especially if you're in a leadership position, to really explore whether the other parts might benefit from being more incremental and delaying decisions to later time in the process, and making more use of timely feedback loops and all that kind of stuff. And so to your example with DevOps kind of being the logical extension of agile practices into operations, I agree with that characterization. And that's one where, we could see a clear benefit through pushing that sort of approach all the way through to production, essentially. But it's a little bit less clear to me, or a lot less clear to me, that it's really going to be meaningful and helpful to push that through budgeting practices, or uh, vendor relationships, or company strategic planning, or some of those kinds of areas. It's not doesn't mean you shouldn't have the conversation about it. Maybe it would work in some companies. It does seem to work, but I think as I come back a lot of agile topics to have the conversation. I'm amazed at how many unvalidated assumptions there are in a lot of what I read about agile, where unvalidated assumptions about how the business will work or what's going to be best for the business. And I mean, some of this sounds like it's written by people who don't have any business experience at all. And so they're making unvalidated assumptions. And the solution is often the same, which is go talk to the business. This is part of what you're supposed to be doing in Agile anyway. And you might learn something if you go talk to the business. And so I think communication is good, and learning is good, and not making unvalidated assumptions is good. This is an area where we see an absence of, or less of that kind of thing than we really should. So um, like it says on the slide, I think we can define the boundaries, just figure out where they are. uh, And then I think the bullet point about defining rules of engagement across the boundaries, this is just all about expectation setting. And if we go talk to our business and we say, well, look, well, we're going to be on a 2-week cadence, and this is kind of the work practice that we need for our technical work to be done effectively. How can we set up the interface with your non-agile part of the organization so that we're supporting you and you're supporting us, and the fact that there's a difference here is not a problem. It works for both of us. And I'm a big fan of clear expectation setting, and so I think the more of that we do, the better.
Speaking of which, can you comment on the definition of roles, or I would say the lack of clarity around roles? Because a lot of times what we find is you can get the teams working well, right? Working with the teams, and you might have a business champion who believes Agile is right for this particular piece of the organization. But then the organization doesn't necessarily sit down with everyone in a management or a leadership position and talk through what their role is now. Is it the same? Is it different? How did it change? What's the expectation? Do you
Yeah.
run into that where roles aren't well defined as part of this? And kind of what does leadership do to get that in order?
Yeah. My company Constructs has been in business for more than 20 years, and we've been dealing with that particular issue the entire time. I don't think it's an agile issue.
Yeah,
I don't think it's
no
a
doubt.
waterfall issue. I think it actually is a little bit better in agile because we do have a few defined roles. We have, if we're doing Scrum, we've got the Scrum Master and product owner, and kind of sort of the team member role. If we're doing safe, then we've got all kinds of definition of the roles. Uh, so I mean that's better than what we had in waterfall. But I would say that in the consulting work my company does, one of the more common recommendations we end up giving is to more clearly define roles and responsibilities. And it's kind of crazy when you take a step back from it and say, if somebody doesn't know what their role is, they literally don't know what their job is. And and that means they literally don't know how to do their job. They might have the ability to do their job, but if it's not clear what their job even is, then that ends up being problematic. At the leadership level, depending on how high you are in the organization, I think the higher you get, the less well-defined the role tends to be, and I think that's actually okay. I mean, part of the leader's job is to make order out of an ambiguous situation, or do something constructive with an ambiguous situation, or see what needs to be done and then do it. Uh, but that's by definition really pretty undefined. But as you get lower in the organization, certainly at the individual contributor level, first level manager level, uh, clearly defining the roles, I think, it just helps everyone. And it goes back, like you said, that's the segue was expectation setting, and I think that's the right way to look at it. It's just about setting expectations about what I'm going to do and what you're going to do and what we're going to collaborate on and what we can do independently, and all that roles and responsibilities stuff is helpful. And we've used RACI charts quite a bit. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but
Yep.
the who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to collaborate, who needs to be informed, uh, and depending on essentially uh, how unclear the roles are in an organization, that can be super helpful exercise to go through. And we've definitely seen light bulbs go off for people where they're like, yeah, I'm not responsible for this or accountable. I don't even know if I need to collaborate. I just need to be informed. And they started out the conversation thinking maybe they were responsible, and they end the conversation thinking, no, I just need to be informed, and let me know when you're done, and talk to me if you need help clearing an impediment, but otherwise I don't need to be deeply involved in this. Uh, and it also can surface when you've got turf wars for something going through the RACI exercise, can surface those, and those can be a little bit uncomfortable in terms of having the conversation where you put actually out on the table and look at the fact that two people are kind of fighting over a certain responsibility. But I don't know, I'm a big fan of making things open and explicit. So, I think that usually works out better to get it on the table and look at it and come up with some kind of explicit expectation setting agreement about it.
Yeah, I would agree. So let's move on to our next discussion point, and that is, a lot of people in the Agile community, and you've heard it a lot, probably said it a lot, right? I know I have, is, well, you need an Agile mindset. You need to be Agile. Don't do Agile. You have to live Agile, right? I mean, that all gets to kind of the cultural aspects of this, right? Take the practices out of the way, take the roles and expectations and all that stuff, and you're left with culture, right? How you work. Well, give me your thoughts on the role that culture plays in Agile, and from a leadership perspective, how do you build the right culture to support an effective Agile approach?
Yeah, I guess if I was a psychologist, I would probably be a behaviorist. I believe attitude follows behavior, and I think in software, we're not talking about religion or a
We're
spiritual
not?
movement. We're talking about uh, business and engineering practices that are supposed to produce practical results for the business or other organization that they're being deployed in. And so, really, that to me says practices, not we start with practices, not with attitude, not with culture, but practices. And then we build up a culture from the practices. And it's not to say that we can't start talking about cultural aspects early on as well, but it is to say, if I'm going to work with an organization on how to benefit from Agile, I'm not going to start out by spending a half a day or a day trying to indoctrinate them on the mindset without actually talking to them about what's going to happen on the ground from the mindset. So, like I think empirical focus is a big deal. Empirical focus says we're going to pay attention to what's happening on the ground. We're not going to ignore experience. We're not going to pretend that the theory is more valid than the real world experience. And if the theory and the real world experience depart, we are going to favor the real world experience, and that's the empirical focus. But pre-Agile, my company used to refer to that as ground truth, the idea that if the map and the terrain disagree, you trust the terrain, not the map. And in software, the experience you're having on the ground, the amount of work you're getting done, the number of defects you're seeing, the delivery pace that you're on, that's all the ground truth for your project. If there's some theory that says if you're using practices A, B, and C, you should be going faster, but the ground truth says you're going slower, then you really need to pay attention to the ground truth. It's possible that you're not actually following the theory, but it's also possible that there's some aspect of the theory that doesn't work in your particular context, or maybe that you're not ready for, not sufficiently skilled for. So, the ground truth, the empirical focus is a really, really big deal. And, this is where I take exception to much of what I've seen written on Agile that comes at it from really more of an idealized point of view. Anytime we start talking about doing Agile the right way, or is somebody truly Agile, that raises the hair on the back of my neck, because when you start talking about the right way and truly Agile, to me that says you don't have an empirical focus. If you have an empirical focus, all you're really going to care about is whether your organization is getting better. And if your organization is getting better, who cares whether you're doing it the right way or whether you're truly Agile? I mean, honestly, I could care less whether an organization is truly Agile. What I care about is that they are paying attention to what's happening, having a good tight feedback loop that helps them improve rapidly, and then actually improving rapidly. If they're improving rapidly, then they're doing a lot of things right, and I don't really care what it gets labeled.
Oh, that's great stuff. Yeah, and I would agree with you. And it seems to me, so it's funny, Steve. I think people that come from the technical, I'll call it the technical angle for Agile, right? So, practices and and maybe we're involved in some of the technical aspects of software development, seem to prefer or feel that Agile should come from the empirical concept, whereas people who came at it from, I'll call it a coaching or a kind of a holistic, maybe it's top down, I don't know, but that don't or haven't built software have a very different attitude about
Yeah.
how to make agile work, right? And of course, as you're mentioning, there's no right way. It really, I love your point about, if you're getting better, that's all that matters, because sometimes we forget, that it's not about agile, it's not about DevOps, it's about business result,
Yeah.
right? And if you can't tie what you're doing to business result and get business result, then who cares what you call it, right? And you've probably had it. We've had organizations we've gone into who have said, we like the practices of Agile and we want you to help us adopt them, but you're not allowed to use the A word here, right?
Yes,
Because,
we have
somebody
had that
doesn't like
exact
that
conversation.
word here,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Have you seen that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we've had that conversation word for word, what you just said. And it's frustrating. I'm sure you felt the frustration too, where you go into an organization and you look at it and you say, these guys could really benefit from shorter iterations and smaller batch requirements and more cross-functional teams but we're not allowed to say the word agile or say the word scrum because they had some really overly idealistic attempt to force an idealized implementation down people's throats, and it didn't meet business needs. And I continue to be, I mean, we've been in this almost 20 years now, and I continue to be baffled at the lack of cognitive dissonance in people who simultaneously look at the Agile Manifesto and say that, we're going to be customer oriented and we're going to value that customer interaction, but we're simultaneously not going to listen to the business when it tells us we need estimates, or we need you guys to make a commitment to deliver functionality by a particular time. It doesn't mean that any of those things are possible in an ideal sense, but just because the business wants them. But the idea that we're just going to shrug off the business needs as invalid because it conflicts with some warped understanding of Scrum or warped understanding of other agile ideals, I don't get how people can have that cognitive dissonance. I mean, it's very clear. It's clear from the very first document that was ever created that had the word agile on it. And yet we're into almost 20 years now of routinely violating that principle or that value. So I know I find that very puzzling.
It is puzzling. So we have a couple minutes left to talk about agile culture. Is there anything else you want to mention in terms of agile culture and the other thoughts you have around culture?
Yeah, so I mean, let's just talk about this diagram. This diagram is from a representation of the OODA loop, which is the observe, orient, decide, act loop. And this, I think, is an interesting model for thinking about how we work in Agile. The idea that it starts with observe, I think, gives focus to that empirical concept, where we don't start with a theory, we start with observation about what's actually going on. Orient says we're going to try to make sense of what we're observing and figure out what we do with it. And then we make a decision about what we're going to do, and then we actually do it. And then we close the loop. We observe what happens and if it worked and whether it didn't work. But the key aspects of this diagram that aren't always clear from representations of OODA loops are the dashed lines. And that is to say, part of what we get from an empirical focus is we get the learned ability, the evidence-based ability to take shortcuts. And so, if we touch the hot stove, we jerk our hand away from it. We don't need to orient and say, ow, my hand hurts, and then think about it. Well, what should I do? Okay, maybe I'll pull my hand away. We short circuit that because we know that we can just take action. We observe, we immediately act. And this is part of the benefit of a really agile, empirically based, inspect and adapt based approach is we figure out what the patterns are and how we can take shortcuts. And this is part of how we get better and faster and have fewer errors and just move more quickly. And and the whole thing comes back to these key concepts of inspect and adapt, the empirical focus, learning from our mistakes, and starting with observation. So I think part of the one of the failure modes of waterfall was that we kind of felt like we had to go through every step. every step on every piece. There was no such thing as a short circuit or the dashed lines in waterfall. And so that, gave rise in many instances to a really burdensome kind of bureaucratic a process. And Agile, if it's implemented well, part of it is to strip away the bureaucracy and provide for rapid but effective and accurate decision making. So, I think that diagram is an important diagram, and if you really dive into it and study it, it captures a lot of what's good about Agile.
No, I like that. That's great stuff. So next slide, Pam, if you could. For those of you that haven't read Steve's book, this is just a taste of the kind of thinking and the types of things that you'll get out of More Effective Agile. Definitely you can pick it up at Amazon. You can pick it up at, pretty much any major book retail chain, online, offline, whatever. And, definitely encourage people to pick up the book. It sounds like it was a fun book to read or to write, Steve. How was the writing process for that versus your other books that you've done? Was it different? Was it the same?
Oh, I could talk about that for a long time.
I bet you could.
So I wrote the first draft of the book extremely quickly, far more quickly than any other book I'd ever written. Most of my other books were a lot more kind of research based. This one was quite a bit more based on the experience we'd had working with companies. So in that sense, the background of the book was in itself kind of an example of Agile practice, where it's more empirically based on our experiences. I mean, there's plenty of research there too, but first and foremost came from our experiences. The thing that was a little different about this book was that the reviewer pool was enormous. I sent the book out to about 600 people, got comments back from about 325 people. And the great thing about reviews, I find, is that people only comment on the things that they care about or that they know a lot about. And as the person taking those reviews, I've learned, because this was my 8th book, that there is a certain amount of pain that goes along with doing an external review, which is you've really got to brace yourself for reading page after page of comments that are critical about what you've written or that try to disagree with it. But I have learned that my books benefit so much from that kind of input that it's worth going through that. And in this case, it was kind of overwhelming because I had so many active reviewers. But the cool thing about it was, there were good comments on every page, and the vast majority of the reviewers, like 80 or 90%, were in senior leadership positions. So they're director and VP, or C-level titles. And so I just got a huge amount of terrific input on the topic, and very much represented from the leadership point of view. And people were sharing experiences and, some of the kinds of things that we've just been talking about. So, strangely enough, I would say I've done external review of all my books before they're published. I would say that because this was going out to so many people, the manuscript that went out to people was in better shape than any other book I've ever done when it went out for external review. But because of the scope of external review, I would say the final book was better than the manuscript than any other book I've ever done as well. So, so that delta between the review manuscript and the final book, I think, is significant in this book. So anyway, it was an interesting book to write. The review process was more than half the effort on this book.
Wow.
So, one of the reviews on Amazon for the book says, because of the extensive review process, this could be viewed as a high fidelity snapshot of the state of Agile practices today. I had not been looking at the review process that way, but I think that's an interesting comment, and could well be right. I had reviewers from, 25 countries or something like that. Certainly concentrated in North America, but there were plenty of reviewers in Europe and elsewhere, and so I think it does represent a good cross section of Agile practices from tons of different kinds of organizations and really all the way around the world.
That's awesome. We want to end. We are going to take questions, so please put your questions into chat. I see some questions are already showing up in there. Please add more. But before we do that, let's take a quick audience poll. Pam, if you could put the poll up. we want to ask you, how effective do you think your Agile is across teams, as we talked, across your kind of organizational structure and boundaries, and across culture? How effective do you see Agile for your particular organization? Okay, so team agility, it looks like most people are kind of in the middle, with some effective, no one not effective, so that's good, right? Progress. I don't think that's too surprising. Do you, Steve? I mean, at the team level, it seems like, of the three things we talked about, I don't know what you feel like, but I feel like that's the one that usually team or organizations make progress on first. Would you agree with that versus
Yeah, usually.
culture?
I
And
mean, I think lots of agile implementations have been grassroots efforts, and so have started at the team level, really. No, I mean, I think you know, this kind of poll for a self-selected audience of people who care enough to attend this sort of webinar, I think is probably going to pull from the people who are paying attention and maybe more committed than average to having an effective implementation. So,
fair
if we
enough.
were to go out and sample
Mhm.
organizations,
You mean do this
that might
empirically?
produce a different result. But with this self-selected
Yeah,
sample of people who actually care, I'm not surprised to see this.
cool. Yeah, it looks like in terms of organizational structure, a little bit less effective versus teams. That's probably not surprising either. And if we scroll down and look below, actually the best. So it looks like, well, in terms of very effective, it seems like culturally, people here feel more comfortable that they're being at least somewhat, if not very effective,
Yeah.
which
Yeah,
is
I mean,
good.
that's an interesting response just because there's the State of Agile survey that another organization does. And the last
Mhm.
few years, they've listed essentially lack of cultural support for Agile as the number one impediment to implementing Agile. So it's interesting that for this group, um, the cultural support is at least somewhat effective. It's, you know, there aren't very many in the very effective category, so that does stand out to me.
Right.
Uh,
Yep. No, interesting stuff. So learning opportunities, just give everyone a heads up. If you're looking to learn more about Agile and at the team level, if you're looking at leadership types of learning opportunities, we do have some things coming up that you might be interested in. 2 live virtual classes that align with this topic. One is a new class that we just created called Coaching Your Agile Team to Quality. It's all about, how do you lead and nudge your team toward a quality product across your organization. And then we're doing our Agile DevOps Leadership Workshop in December, which is always a great class. It's 2-day physical, 3 half days in terms of a virtual approach. Don't forget about the upcoming conferences that are coming up soon. Agile Plus DevOps is in early November, and our Agile Plus DevOps Leadership Summit is the next week thereafter. So definitely check those out online. And to thank everybody for coming today to the Coveros webinar. We are offering a discount code for 20% savings on training and conference registrations. So if you use this code when you register, you get 20% off as a thank you for attending the webinar. Thank you very much for attending. The last thing I want to mention before we leave is if you're not a member of the Hub, the TechWell Hub, please join. We have over 6,000 software professionals that are part of the Slack-based community we started a couple of years ago. There's actually there's a channel on Agile Leadership. It's Agile_leadership. I'm actually going to head over there for a bit after the webinar. If anybody has additional questions or comments, you're free to join us there. So with that, let's take some questions. We do have another webinar, but not until next year. Happy New Year, everybody, when it comes. I'm glad to see 2020 behind us at that point. We do have a tentative guest for that webinar, but that person has not yet gotten approval from their organization to announce that. So look for an announcement on that. So with that, we can answer questions.
Okay, we have 3 questions from Cecilia. Question number 1, in your opinion, what are the top 3 practices that an Agile team must do?
What do you think, Steve?
Well, I guess I have 2 reactions to the question. One is I kind of hate questions like what are the top 3 practices of anything, because if something is halfway useful, it's doubtful that it can be boiled down into 3 practices. So, that's one reaction. But my other reaction is I would say there's one key practice. If you're going to boil it down to some small number of practices, it's one, and that's inspect and adapt. And much of the rest of Agile can be inferred from inspect and adapt. Why do you have short feedback loops? Gives you a more frequent opportunity to inspect and adapt. Why do you have an empirical focus? Because you need to be inspecting what's actually going on. Why do you do small batch requirements, small batch design? Because it supports short feedback loops. It supports more frequent inspect and adapt cycles. Why do you have Scrum retrospectives? Because it supports inspect and adapt. So I would say there's one practice that really, if you have to boil it down, that's what I would boil it down to. What do you think, Jeff?
No, that's a great one. I was thinking, when you were answering that I was trying to guess what you were going to say. And I didn't hit it perfectly, but I understand where you're coming from. I was thinking it was going to be, small batch sizes or small increments. But of course, that's hugely tied to, inspecting and adapting frequently, right? Which you have to do if you're going to, be successful. And to me, it all gets back to, how do you give customers value, right? And how do you give it to them continuously, ideally? And that's inspecting and adapting and just making sure you keep the customer in the loop.
Yeah, I think that's a really good add. I think inspect and adapt does not, in my mind, automatically imply a strong customer focus. And so I think that's a really good add that, if we were to tune up our phrasing a little bit, inspect and adapt with a customer focus or something like that, that might be a good way to still keep it to one practice, but draw in kind of a North Star. So what is the guiding light of your inspect and adapt? I think that still wouldn't draw in notion of sustainable pace or, that kind of thing. So, and I do think it's hard to distill it down into a couple of pithy things. I end up in the book, I think I have 26 key principles, and that's already somewhat distilled.
I noticed you always use a number that's not round whenever you do a list of, I was reading something else, one of your blogs, and it was like the 16 of whatever.
Of whatever, yeah.
Yeah, so that was cool.
Most of that's just accidental. I just put whatever number on.
Sure.
Sometimes for keynote talks or whatever, I'll do a round number like 10 or 7, but the key principles just happened to end up being whatever number. I think it was 26.
Okay. There you go. Another question,
The other
Alexa?
thing I would throw in there as a really, really important idea, which we didn't really have a chance to talk about in the main segment today, is the idea of growth mindset. And inspect and adapt coupled with growth mindset. I think that those two together definitely imply that you're not going to burn out the team. You can't really be growing if you're constantly task focused and urgency addicted. So, growth mindset plus inspect and adapt plus customer focus. Without trying super hard to come up with a really decisive list of top 3 practices, that seems like three pretty good focuses to me.
Yeah, and one that popped into my head when you were talking, you mentioned sustainability. I think teams struggle immensely with that. I think it's a practice that Agile teams and leadership often ignore, right? Because our industry has always been one where, the expectation was you were working like mad, as fast and as mad as you could. And, Agile was really, it wasn't the first, but it called out, sustainability as a key practice, which, intellectually we all agree with. But I see Agile teams killing themselves based on being driven by the org and not understanding how to push back. I always joke that sprint's a really bad word to have created for an iteration because the sprint is about going at top speed as fast as you can and then just laying and gasping it when you're at the finish line. And that's not a sustainable kind of a model. You don't run a marathon by sprinting every 100 meters and then starting and sprinting again, right?
Well,
but that's what we called it in Scrum, is sprints, right?
Right. The ratios are way off at best. The idea that you're going to sprint for 9 days and then rest for 1 day, or sprint for 9.5 days and rest for half a day. That's not how sprinting works. If you could do that, you could run a marathon by sprinting, but no. So that whole idea of sprint fatigue, or the sprint hamster wheel, we've certainly seen those a lot too. And I think this is just one of those factors that I think that a lot of the motivation for Agile practices and some aspects of Agile culture were designed to counteract that. But we still get humans implementing these practices, and some of it comes down to just comes down to individuals' ability to communicate and have conversations. I was struck. This goes back quite a ways now, but I went to back-to-back presentations with Kent Beck and Watts Humphrey. And Kent Beck as the inventor of extreme programming, and Watts Humphrey as the main author of the software CMM. You could view these as diametrically opposed thought leaders in software. But what struck me in going to these two back-to-back presentations by these guys is that both of them ended up spending a lot of time talking about how the practices don't matter if people don't follow them, and that courage, both of them use the word courage, that courage is needed to basically push back on organizational influences that are going to sabotage your ability to implement the practices. And I was really struck by the fact that both these guys are super sharp, super experienced guys. They come to pretty different conclusions about what good ways to do software development are. But at some level, they also have a pretty high overlap in some of the soft aspects of what's needed to be successful. And so these soft skills of communication and, in their words, courage, pretty interesting to see those called out by kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum.
Alexa, you have another question from someone?
Yes, about Agile testing. Do you have best practices for testers that are part of an Agile team or a trying to be Agile team?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, when we're talking about Agile testers, I don't know that the job has changed hugely from sequential development days, other than the fact that smaller batch sizes and tighter communication with the team, and concept that normally the tester is going to be part of the team. I would say, so I mean, in terms of the technical test practices, I would say the answer is, learn as much as you can about technical test practices. But if we really want to say, what's a best practice for a tester, a test professional that's part of an Agile team, I would say one of the best practices that nobody really talks about is mentoring all the developers in testing. Agile is supposed to involve developers doing more testing of their own work, but most developers really don't understand how to test their own work. They understand how to use the tools, but it's classic to have a developer who might understand how to use JUnit, but they still only get 50% test coverage on their code. So I think that if you want to do a best practice that's not just get better at testing, which is generic, not Agile, taking seriously the idea that we want to tighten that feedback loop as much as we can, which means if developers are testing their own code, that's a much tighter feedback loop than having a tester test their code. And so having the skills enhancement, that goes back to that role density diagram that we started with, the skills enhancement of the developers becoming better at test, I think a tester can play a really, really beneficial role there.
Yeah, I agree 100% with you on that, Steve. In fact, I wrote a paper, it was on pairing, it was about dev test pairing. How do developers and testers work together and help each other? And, one of the things that I did mention in there, which I agree with you, is that most developers, really because they've never been trained, partially because they've never been trained and partially because that's not what they really want to do is test, let's face it. I mean, we as developers, you have to do it, but it's kind of like, it's not your favorite activity necessarily. And so you might not do a good job of it, or you might not take it as maybe seriously as you can, but a tester can help a developer learn how to test effectively, right? What to do and how to do it and how to work. The other thing I would say in terms of, how do you get, testers better integrated in and being successful is I love the idea of using tests to specify behavior. Whether you call that BDD or acceptance test driven development, or just, good tests against your acceptance criteria or your exit criteria for stories. If you want to get testers out of this, like, sitting and waiting for code to show up at their doorstep, which if you do that in a sprint, when it's going to show up, unfortunately, very, very, very late. Get involved up front, create tests that drive and specify behavior with your team up front, instead of waiting and doing that out of band or whatnot in the process. And if you can get tests created up front that specify behavior and have your teams use that to help validate what they're building as part of the developer testing, it really positions you differently and makes the quality of your product much better too.
Yeah, and I'll agree with you emphatically on that too. One of the anti-patterns that we see, and we're not uncommon, other people have commented on this too, is the idea that most of your stories are completed toward the end of the sprint is an anti-pattern. And we really want to see stories being completed, meaning fully tested, over the entire duration of the sprint, not just at the end. If it's at the end, that's an indication that we're not being as incremental as we could be in our approach to the work. And it's probably an indication that the testers are twiddling their thumbs early in the sprint and then overloaded at the end of the sprint, as you said. And so I'll just throw one other bit of wood on the fire here, which is that I know your company historically has been a bit more focused on tests than my company, but I'll say I think most developers do not understand how deep an area test is. And I think you could argue that the knowledge area of test is deeper than the knowledge area of development when you really get into it. And I think most developers would listen to that statement and just say, no, how could that possibly be the case? But most developers have never read one book on testing. They don't have any idea what any of the named test practices are. And so, yeah, I mean, just getting some exposure to how deep that knowledge area is and what's possible would really, and for developers who do that, I think they become better developers because they learn other ways to think about their code and other ways to think about how it might break and how to think about complexity and how to think about the logical structure of the code. And just knowing more about test, I think, makes people better developers. So lots of reasons to focus on test.
Hey, that's great, Steve. And I know we're over time. I appreciate people hanging around and listening to us jam on this stuff, but we probably should wrap up the webinar. We can move any additional questions over to the hub. As mentioned, I'm planning to head over there after this for a bit. Happy to answer questions in the Agile Leadership channel. Thanks, Steve, for being involved. It was great hearing your thoughts and really good ideas and insights, and appreciate you being on the webinar today.
Hey, thanks for the invitation, Jeff. I'm always happy to have a chance to sit down and talk with you, and it's been nice to catch up a little bit.
Yeah, we need to do it more often.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for attending, and we're hoping to see you at another event, in the coming weeks or months. Take care, everybody.